Corporal Vernon Park gripped the sides of his amphibious tractor as it churned through the Pacific swells toward the dark island ahead. "I was petrified when we got into those Amtraks," he would later recall. "I was new to battle, but I could sense that even the veterans were scared." The morning of February 19th, 1945, had begun with steak and eggs, a gourmet breakfast served to 70,000 Marines before they boarded their landing craft. Now, as diesel fumes mixed with salt spray and the acrid smell of fear, these young Americans, most barely 20 years old, stared at their destination with growing dread. One aviator had described the island perfectly. It looked like a burned pork chop in the middle of the ocean. 8 square miles of black volcanic sand, no trees, no fresh water, no signs of life. Just a barren wasteland dominated by Mount Suribachi, a volcanic cinder cone rising from the island's southern tip. The island had a name that would soon become synonymous with American sacrifice: Iwo Jima. 3 months earlier, on December 8, 1944, a massive formation of B-29 superfortresses and B-24 Liberator heavy bombers had flown high above the Pacific Ocean. Their target was this same small island, and they dropped thousands of tons of munitions across its dark volcanic landscape. The Japanese defenders offered only light anti-aircraft fire in response. This raid marked the beginning of 74 consecutive days of bombing missions, an unprecedented aerial bombardment against an island measuring just 8 square miles. Every day, for over 10 weeks, American aircraft pounded Iwo Jima with explosives. Yet the strategic importance of this seemingly insignificant rock demanded its capture. The island sat directly in the path of America's strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese mainland. Japanese fighters, based on Iwo Jima, regularly harassed the massive B-29 formations flying toward Japan, while enemy bombers launched from the island's airfields struck newly conquered American territories to the east. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, recognized that eliminating this threat was essential before the impending invasion of Okinawa. The island's 2 airfields could serve as emergency landing strips for damaged American bombers returning from Japan, a capability that could save thousands of airmen's lives. On November 9, 1944, Nimitz informed Lieutenant General Holland Smith, commander of the Fleet Marine Force, that he would lead Operation Detachment, the assault on Iwo Jima. American military leadership expressed confidence that this would be a swift operation against weakened Japanese defenses. The assessment seemed reasonable based on available intelligence. Reconnaissance flights revealed no buildings suitable for housing soldiers on the black landscape. There was no fresh water source to sustain a large garrison. American intelligence estimated only 12,000 weakened Japanese troops defended the island, a force that could surely be overcome within days by 70,000 Marines supported by overwhelming naval firepower. Smith, nicknamed Howlin' Mad for his aggressive temperament, had built his reputation on successful Pacific amphibious assaults. His Marines had proven their mettle from Tarawa to Saipan, adapting and overcoming every challenge the Japanese military could devise. Previous island campaigns had followed predictable patterns: overwhelming firepower followed by rapid Japanese collapse. But 8,000 miles away, a Japanese general was transforming this barren rock into something neither American intelligence nor military planners could imagine. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had arrived on Iwo Jima with the 109th Infantry Division, bearing the personal blessing of Emperor Hirohito himself. The emperor had impressed upon Kuribayashi the vital importance of his mission during a private audience. Iwo Jima was part of the Tokyo Prefecture, and thus Japanese soil itself. it must be defended to the last man. Kuribayashi understood perfectly that he had been given a deadly assignment. Unlike other Japanese commanders who clung to hopes of victory, he harbored no illusions about defeating the American invasion. Instead, he intended to exact such a horrific price in American blood that the United States might reconsider its march toward Japan. Throughout the winter of 1944, while American bombers pounded the surface daily, Kuribayashi's men worked tirelessly underground. Rather than the estimated 12,000 defenders, he commanded 21,000 troops who had spent months tunneling into the island's volcanic rock. The Japanese had completed more than 11 miles of interconnected underground passages by the time of the invasion, with plans to extend the network to 17 miles. This subterranean fortress was unlike anything American forces had encountered in the Pacific. Over 750 defensive positions dotted the island, many equipped with steel doors that could be closed when gun crews needed to reload, minimizing exposure to enemy counterfire. These weren't simple foxholes or bunkers. Kuribayashi had revolutionized defensive warfare by creating positions that could be reoccupied after Marines thought they had cleared them. Japanese soldiers could move from position to position through the tunnel network without ever exposing themselves to American observation or fire. Most importantly, Kuribayashi had forbidden the banzai charges that had characterized Japanese defense throughout the Pacific War. His men were ordered to remain alive as long as possible, selling their lives dearly rather than throwing them away in glorious but futile attacks. Every bullet, every grenade, every moment of survival should inflict maximum casualties on the American invaders. The American bombardment plan reflected the military's confidence in swift victory. General Smith had requested 10 days of intensive naval bombardment to soften the island's defenses before his Marines landed. Instead, Navy planners reduced this to just 3 days, arguing that the 74 days of aerial bombing had already neutralized Japanese resistance. Poor weather further hampered the abbreviated bombardment by preventing reconnaissance aircraft from providing accurate target coordinates to the warships offshore. When the bombardment concluded, the Navy had delivered merely 1.5 days of effective heavy bombardment, despite promising 3, a reduction that would prove catastrophically insufficient. On February 16, 1945, over 600 American warships and transports departed the Marianas Islands. The 70,000-man invasion force represented the largest marine assault in Pacific theater history. These men had been told only that they were heading to Island X. Their actual destination remained classified until the final approach. Among the warships were veterans of Pearl Harbor seeking revenge. The battleships Nevada and Tennessee, survivors of the December 7th attack that had brought America into the war, now trained their 14-inch guns on Japanese positions. 6 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and dozens of destroyers prepared to unleash devastating firepower on the island's 724 priority targets. Yet Kuribayashi's preparations had anticipated every aspect of the American assault. The island's geography forced any invasion to focus on a single beach directly beneath Mount Suribachi's commanding heights. Japanese artillery positions had been precisely sited to create interlocking fields of fire across this inevitable landing zone. When American ships strayed too close to shore during the preliminary bombardment, hidden Japanese 120mm guns demonstrated their continued effectiveness by hitting several vessels, including the Tennessee and cruiser Pensacola, inflicting casualties among their crews. As dawn broke on February 19th, Marines aboard the invasion fleet consumed their final meal before battle. The Black Island loomed before them, its volcanic slopes rising from dark beaches toward the cinder cone that dominated the southern landscape. Many veterans sensed something different about this operation, an ominous quality that distinguished Iwo Jima from previous Pacific campaigns. The first wave would be spearheaded by 482 amphibious tractors that could sail through water like boats before driving up onto the beach. Each Amtrak mounted a 75mm gun and two 50 caliber machine guns, providing mobile fire support for the Marines inside. Behind them followed waves of landing craft carrying tanks, artillery, supplies, and reinforcements for what planners expected would be a brief, decisive battle. On February 16, 1945, as 600 American warships appeared on Iwo Jima's horizon, Kuribayashi gave his final order to his 21,000 defenders hidden in their underground fortress. Do not fire until the beach is completely full of Americans. What happened next would create the bloodiest square mile in Marine Corps history. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi stood at the entrance to one of his underground command bunkers, watching his soldiers emerge from the tunnels like ghosts from the volcanic rock. The daily American bombing raids had just ended, and his men returned to their surface positions with methodical precision. For 3 months, this ritual had continued: hide during the bombardment, emerge when the planes departed, continue the work that would turn Iwo Jima into Japan's most formidable fortress. Kuribayashi understood his mission with crystal clarity. During his private audience with Emperor Hirohito in Tokyo, the weight of imperial expectation had settled on his shoulders like a burial shroud. The emperor had made clear that Iwo Jima was not merely another Pacific island. It was Japanese home territory, part of the Tokyo prefecture itself. The general left that meeting knowing he carried the personal expectations of his divine sovereign. In letters to his wife, Kuribayashi wrote with brutal honesty about his assignment. His correspondence reflected a man who understood that his death was not just likely, but strategically necessary. He wrote of his resolve to die defending the island, and his determination to make the Americans pay dearly for every foot of ground. These were not the words of a man planning victory. They were the final testament of a commander preparing for a battle he could not win but might yet influence. The general's revolutionary approach to island defense flew in the face of traditional Japanese military doctrine. Throughout the Pacific War, Japanese commanders had relied on massive banzai charges, glorious human wave attacks that sought to overwhelm American positions through sheer courage and sacrifice. These attacks had proven both spectacular and spectacularly ineffective, serving mainly to provide American machine gunners with concentrated targets. Kuribayashi banned such suicidal mass charges entirely. Instead, he ordered his 21,000 defenders to dig deeper, hide better, and survive longer. His unofficial philosophy emphasized maximum attrition. Each defender should strive to kill as many Americans as possible before dying. The island would become a meat grinder, consuming American lives at a rate that might force the United States to reconsider its advance toward Japan. The centerpiece of his strategy lay beneath the volcanic surface. Japanese engineers and ordinary soldiers worked with picks, shovels, and dynamite to carve a subterranean world from Iwo Jima's rock. By February 1945, they had completed more than 11 miles of interconnected tunnels, with ambitious plans to extend the network to 17 miles. The work proceeded around the clock, with shifts of men labouring in the stifling underground heat, while others maintained surface defences. These passages weren't crude caves or simple shelters. Japanese engineers had created a sophisticated underground fortress with multiple levels, ventilation systems, and interconnected chambers that could house entire units. Medical stations, ammunition depots, command centers, and sleeping quarters existed in a hidden world that American reconnaissance flights could never detect. Some tunnels descended 75 feet beneath the surface, deep enough to survive the heaviest naval bombardment. The construction process required ingenious solutions to seemingly impossible engineering problems. Volcanic rock proved both blessing and curse, hard enough to provide excellent protection once excavated, but extremely difficult to tunnel through with available equipment. Japanese engineers improvised ventilation systems using captured materials and salvaged components from destroyed aircraft. They created drainage systems to handle the island's occasional rainfall and designed storage areas that could preserve food, water, and ammunition for extended sieges. The tunnel entrances were masterpieces of camouflage and engineering. Hidden beneath fallen rocks, concealed behind false cave-ins, or disguised as natural volcanic formations, these openings remained invisible to American aerial photography. Multiple entrances and exits for each underground complex meant that if one entrance was discovered and sealed, defenders could continue operating from alternate routes. Some entrances were positioned near obvious defensive positions to draw American attention away from hidden tunnels nearby. Above ground, 750 defensive positions created an intricate web of interlocking fire zones. Each position had been carefully surveyed and sited to cover specific approach routes that American forces would be compelled to use. Many bunkers featured steel doors that could be closed during bombardments, protecting the gun crews and equipment inside until American infantry approached within killing range. The positions were constructed using reinforced concrete, steel plates salvaged from ships, and innovative use of natural rock formations. The positions themselves defied conventional military logic. Rather than manning obvious defensive lines, Japanese strongpoints were scattered throughout the island in seemingly random patterns. Machine gun nests were positioned to fire across each other's fields of fire, creating crossfire zones that would devastate attacking forces. Anti-tank guns were hidden in positions with clear fields of fire toward the landing beaches, ready to destroy American armor as it struggled through the volcanic sand. Kuribayashi's most innovative feature was the interconnected nature of his defensive network. American forces had learned to expect that once they cleared a Japanese position, it would remain cleared. On Iwo Jima, positions that appeared neutralized could be reoccupied within hours through the tunnel system. Marines would advance past bunkers they thought were destroyed, only to find themselves under fire from behind as Japanese soldiers emerged from hidden entrances. Communication systems linked the scattered defensive positions through telephone lines buried deep underground and protected by concrete conduits. Command and control would remain centralized even as individual positions came under attack. Kuribayashi could coordinate the defense from his command bunker, directing reinforcements through the tunnel system and concentrating fire on the most threatening American advances. Backup communication methods included runners who could move unseen through the tunnel network and pre-arranged signal systems for coordinated attacks. The defensive plan took advantage of Iwo Jima's unique geography in ways that American planners failed to anticipate. The island's irregular shape and volcanic terrain channeled any amphibious assault toward a single viable landing beach on the southeastern shore. This beach sat directly beneath Mount Suribachi, giving Japanese observers perfect visibility over every American movement. The volcanic sand that covered much of the island would bog down American vehicles, forcing infantry to advance on foot across open ground under constant observation. While Kuribayashi prepared his underground fortress, American intelligence services struggled to understand what they faced. Aerial reconnaissance flights revealed an apparently barren island with minimal defensive preparations. Photo interpreters could identify the two airfields and some surface installations, but the extensive tunnel network remained completely hidden. Intelligence analysts noted the absence of obvious troop concentrations or major defensive works, leading them to conclude that Japanese strength had been significantly degraded by months of bombing. Most critically, intelligence estimates placed Japanese strength at 12,000 troops, nearly half the actual garrison size. This miscalculation stemmed partly from the difficulty of detecting troops living underground, and partly from wishful thinking among American planners who wanted to believe their bombing campaign had been effective. The absence of visible activity on the island's surface seemed to confirm these optimistic assessments. The 74-day bombing campaign that preceded the invasion seemed to confirm American assumptions about Japanese weakness. Day after day, B-29 superfortresses and B-24 liberators pounded the island with thousands of tons of high explosives. The lack of significant anti-aircraft fire suggested that Japanese defenses had been effectively neutralized. American pilots reported secondary explosions and fires that appeared to indicate the destruction of ammunition dumps and fuel storage areas. In reality, the bombing campaign was striking empty positions and carefully prepared decoys. Kuribayashi had ordered his men to minimize anti-aircraft fire, preserving his guns and ammunition for the actual invasion. The secondary explosions that impressed American aircrews often came from small fuel dumps placed specifically to create the illusion of significant damage. Meanwhile, the real defensive positions remained untouched in their underground sanctuaries, protected by tons of volcanic rock and reinforced concrete. The ineffectiveness of the aerial bombardment extended to the naval gunfire that preceded the landing. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commander of the amphibious force, had initially planned a 10-day naval bombardment to soften Japanese defenses before the Marines landed. General Holland Smith had enthusiastically endorsed this plan, knowing that thorough preparation could save thousands of American lives. Naval authorities, however, had different priorities. The Pacific Fleet was simultaneously supporting operations in the Philippines while preparing for the upcoming invasion of Okinawa. Fleet commanders argued that 10 days of intensive bombardment would consume ammunition stocks needed for other operations. They reduced Smith's requested bombardment to just 3 days, confident that the prolonged aerial campaign had already accomplished most necessary destruction. Weather conditions further reduced the effectiveness of the abbreviated naval bombardment. Cloud cover and rain prevented spotting aircraft from accurately directing naval gunfire onto specific targets. Many shells fell harmlessly into empty areas, while Japanese positions remained untouched. When the bombardment concluded on February 18th, the Navy had delivered approximately a day and a half of effective heavy gunfire against an enemy that remained largely intact and completely hidden. The Japanese tested American resolve during the preliminary bombardment by engaging ships that approached too close to shore. Hidden coastal defense guns, primarily 120mm weapons, positioned in reinforced concrete casements, opened fire on several occasions. The battleship Tennessee and heavy cruiser Pensacola both took hits during these exchanges, suffering casualties among their crews and demonstrating that Japanese resistance remained very much alive. These engagements should have warned American commanders that their intelligence estimates were dangerously wrong, is less than Hazone, 0# is greater than. Instead, fleet commanders interpreted the limited Japanese response as evidence of weakened defenses. The fact that only a few guns had opened fire suggested that most defensive positions had indeed been destroyed by the prolonged bombing campaign. Naval intelligence officers reported to their superiors that Japanese resistance would likely collapse once the Marines came ashore in force. Kuribayashi watched the American fleet assemble offshore with grim satisfaction. His spotters counted more than 600 vessels of all types: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft carriers, transports, and landing craft. The Armada represented the largest amphibious force ever assembled in the Pacific, carrying 70,000 Marines and their equipment toward his carefully prepared killing ground. Everything was proceeding exactly as he had planned. The general's final preparations included detailed instructions for his subordinate commanders. No position was to open fire until the landing beaches were completely filled with American troops and equipment. The initial waves must be allowed to land unopposed, creating the impression that Japanese resistance had indeed collapsed. Only when the maximum number of Americans were exposed on the beach should the hidden guns reveal themselves. On February 16, 1945, 600 American warships appeared on the horizon. The Marines had been told they were going to Island X. In 72 hours, they would discover what hell actually looked like. Dawn broke over Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, revealing a grey Pacific sky streaked with the smoke of naval gunfire. The final bombardment had intensified throughout the night, with dozens of capital ships and cruisers and hundreds of escorts, part of an invasion fleet of roughly 450 ships, pounding the dark island with everything they possessed. The battleships Nevada and Tennessee, survivors of Pearl Harbor who had waited 3 years for this moment of revenge, sent 14-inch shells screaming toward Japanese positions with methodical precision. Aboard the transport ships anchored offshore, 70,000 Marines consumed their final meal before battle. Navy cooks had prepared a feast normally reserved for special occasions: thick steaks, fresh eggs cooked to order, hot coffee, and all the bread a man could eat. The gourmet breakfast represented a grim tradition in amphibious warfare. Give the men the best possible meal before sending them into hell, because many would never eat again. Corporal Vernon Park of the 28th Marine Regiment sat in his assigned transport, watching older Marines write final letters to wives and mothers they might never see again. The 19-year-old from Ohio had joined the Corps straight from high school, drawn by recruiting posters that promised adventure and glory in the Pacific. Now, staring at the black island that dominated the horizon, he wondered if his parents would ever learn exactly how he died. "I was petrified when we got into those Amtraks," Park would later recall. "I was new to battle, but I could sense that even the veterans were scared. The fear was visible in the faces around him, men who had survived Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan, displaying an anxiety that transcended normal pre-battle nerves. Something about this operation felt different, more dangerous, more final than previous campaigns. The amphibious tractors that would carry the first wave to shore represented the cutting edge of American military technology. These Amtraks could function as both boats and land vehicles, powered by engines that drove them through water at 5 knots before engaging tracks that could climb up onto beaches. Each vehicle mounted a 75mm gun in a rotating turret, along with 2 50 caliber machine guns for close support. In theory, they provided mobile firepower that could suppress enemy positions while delivering 30 Marines directly onto the beach. Hundreds of Amtraks from several amphibian tractor battalions formed the spearhead of the assault, arranged in waves that would hit the beach at precisely timed intervals. Behind them came landing craft carrying Sherman tanks, artillery pieces, supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements, everything needed to establish and expand the beachhead. The entire operation depended on the assumption that Japanese resistance would be minimal after months of bombardment. At 7:30 in the morning, the naval bombardment reached its crescendo. Battleship guns fired at maximum rate, sending shells weighing as much as small automobiles toward targets that had been painstakingly identified by intelligence officers. The noise was beyond description, a continuous thunder that made conversation impossible and left Marines stunned even with their ears plugged. Smoke and dust obscured the island completely, creating the impression that nothing could possibly survive such devastating firepower. LCI gunboats and rocket-armed craft moved into position just 2,500 yards from shore. At precisely 8:30, they expended nearly 10,000 rockets in the pre-landing barrage that lit up the morning sky. The rockets struck in a rolling crescendo of explosions that seemed to shake the very ocean, adding their destructive power to the ongoing naval gunfire. Aircraft from Task Force 58's carriers added their contribution to the pre-landing bombardment. Corsair fighters and Helldiver dive bombers swept over the island in precise formations, dropping napalm canisters and conventional bombs on any position that might threaten the landing force. Pilots reported little air opposition, minimal anti-aircraft fire, no visible movement, no signs of organized resistance. The island appeared lifeless beneath its shroud of smoke and dust. At 8:59, exactly 1 minute ahead of schedule, the first Amtrak touched the black sand of Iwo Jima's southeastern beach. Marines leaped from the vehicles and fanned out across the volcanic terrain, weapons ready, expecting immediate enemy contact. Instead, they found only eerie silence, broken by the distant rumble of the naval bombardment shifting to targets further inland. The absence of enemy fire created an almost surreal atmosphere on the landing beach. Marines who had steeled themselves for immediate combat found themselves running across open ground without opposition, wondering if the preliminary bombardment had actually succeeded in destroying Japanese resistance. Radio operators began transmitting optimistic reports back to the command ships, describing successful landings and minimal enemy activity. Wave after wave of Amtraks churned onto the beach, disgorging their human cargo onto the volcanic sand. Equipment followed: radios, ammunition, medical supplies, heavy weapons, everything needed to sustain an amphibious assault against determined opposition. Yet, that opposition remained mysteriously absent as hundreds, then thousands of Marines established positions on Japanese soil. The beach itself presented unexpected challenges that had not been fully anticipated by American planners. Reconnaissance photographs had suggested a relatively flat landing area suitable for vehicle operations. Instead, Marines encountered volcanic sand embankments, rising 15 feet above the waterline, natural barriers created by centuries of wind and wave action. The fine, loose sand offered no traction for tracked vehicles, causing tanks and Amtraks to bog down within yards of the water's edge. Sherman tanks attempting to climb these embankments found their tracks spinning uselessly in the soft volcanic material. The sand was unlike anything American forces had encountered in previous Pacific campaigns. Neither the coral of Tarawa nor the jungle soil of Guadalcanal had prepared crews for this unique terrain. Vehicles that managed to reach the top of the embankments immediately sank up to their drive sprockets, effectively immobilized until engineers could clear paths through the obstacles. By 9:30, the landing beach resembled a massive traffic jam rather than a combat zone. Hundreds of vehicles crowded the narrow strip of usable terrain between the water and the impassable embankments, creating exactly the kind of concentrated target that military planners worked desperately to avoid. Marines began to feel exposed and vulnerable despite the continued absence of enemy fire. Easy Company of the 3rd Battalion, 28th Marine Regiment, came ashore under the shadow of Mount Suribachi at 9:45. Led by Captain Dave Severance, they fanned out to support the advancing assault units, moving with the practiced efficiency of veterans who had survived previous campaigns. Lieutenant Keith Wells of the 3rd Platoon looked up at the volcanic cone that dominated the southern end of the island, noting how perfectly it commanded the entire landing area. At exactly that moment, Wells watched Mount Suribachi transform into what he later described as a Christmas tree with blinking lights. Muzzle flashes erupted from dozens of concealed positions on the mountain's slopes as Japanese artillery and machine guns revealed themselves for the first time since the bombardment began. The illusion of an easy landing evaporated in an instant as Lieutenant General Kuribayashi sprang his carefully prepared trap. The hurricane of enemy fire that descended on the congested beach defied description. Hundreds of interlocking defensive positions opened fire simultaneously, creating coordinated fields of death that had been precisely calculated to maximize American casualties. Machine guns, mortars, artillery pieces, and anti-tank guns that had remained hidden throughout the lengthy bombardment suddenly revealed themselves with devastating effect. Marines who had been moving confidently across the sand moments earlier now found themselves pinned down by accurate fire from positions they couldn't even see. The Japanese had constructed their defensive works with steel doors that could be closed during bombardments, protecting the gun crews inside until American infantry approached within range. Now those doors opened to reveal weapons that had survived the massive preliminary bombardment completely intact. The first few minutes under fire created chaos throughout the landing force. Marines who had trained extensively for amphibious assault found themselves facing a type of defensive fire they had never encountered. Rather than coming from obvious positions that could be identified and suppressed, the enemy fire seemed to emerge from the volcanic landscape itself. Muzzle flashes appeared from rock formations, cave entrances, and camouflaged bunkers that were virtually invisible even from close range. Vernon Park, crouched behind his stranded Amtrak, watched in horror as Japanese artillery fire began to find the range of the crowded beach. The volcanic sand that had immobilized American vehicles now became a deadly trap, preventing rapid movement away from the killing zone. Marines attempting to dig foxholes in the loose sand found their positions collapsing as quickly as they could excavate them. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal, who had landed with the first wave, later compared surviving the initial barrage to running through rain and not getting wet. The randomness of survival under such intense fire created a nightmarish lottery where courage and training mattered less than pure chance. Men died within feet of others who emerged without a scratch, creating psychological trauma that would haunt survivors for decades. Combat engineers, the Navy construction battalions known as Seabees, faced the desperate task of clearing paths through the sand embankments while under direct fire. Japanese artillery crews had zeroed their weapons on likely breakthrough points, turning each engineering effort into a deadly race against time. Despite taking heavy casualties, these men worked with extraordinary courage to bulldoze passages that would allow vehicles to move inland. The courage displayed during those first hours under fire would become legendary in Marine Corps history. Individual Marines performed acts of heroism that saved dozens of lives, often at the cost of their own. Medical corpsmen crawled across open ground under machine gun fire to reach wounded comrades, dragging them to safety behind whatever cover could be found. Radio operators maintained communication with offshore naval forces despite being primary targets for Japanese snipers. Naval gunfire support, coordinated by shore-fire control parties that had suffered early casualties, attempted to suppress the most threatening Japanese positions. The battleships Nevada and Tennessee, along with their escort of cruisers and destroyers, shifted their fire to to targets identified by Marines on the beach. However, the well-concealed Japanese positions proved extremely difficult to locate and destroy with naval gunfire, even when directed by observers who could see muzzle flashes. By 10:35, despite the devastating enemy fire, elements of the 28th Marine Regiment achieved a crucial breakthrough. Easy Company managed a dangerous charge across the narrow neck of the island, reaching the western shore and successfully cutting off Mount Suribachi from potential reinforcement. Sherman tanks from the 4th Tank Battalion, finally freed from the sand embankments by Seabee efforts, moved forward to seal the ring around the extinct volcano. The isolation of Mount Suribachi represented the first significant tactical success of the landing, but it came at enormous cost. The Marines who accomplished this feat had advanced through a nightmare of artillery and machine gun fire that left entire platoons combat ineffective. Yet they had demonstrated that Japanese resistance, however fierce, could be overcome through determination and coordinated action. In the center of the landing zone, the 27th Marine Regiment faced a different but equally deadly challenge. Japanese positions concealed in the approaches to the southern airfield had created a killing field that decimated advancing units. Charlie Company of the 1st Battalion found itself pinned down just short of the runway, unable to advance or withdraw under the withering enemy fire. The airfield represented a crucial objective that had to be captured on the first day to provide emergency landing facilities for damaged American aircraft. Its runways and taxi areas offered the only flat ground on the island suitable for large-scale aircraft operations. Yet Japanese defensive positions had been sited to turn any assault on the airfield into a massacre. As the morning progressed, the full scope of American intelligence failures became apparent. Rather than the estimated 12,000 weakened defenders, Kuribayashi's 21,000 troops were demonstrating discipline, training, and equipment that surpassed anything American forces had encountered in previous Pacific campaigns. The tunnel network that connected defensive positions allowed Japanese forces to coordinate their fire and move reinforcements without exposure to American observation. Individual acts of heroism began to accumulate as Marines adapted to the unprecedented defensive fire they faced. Small unit leaders improvised tactics that would enable their men to survive and advance against positions that seemed impregnable. Flamethrower teams worked in coordination with riflemen and automatic weapons crews to clear bunkers that had survived the naval bombardment. These techniques, developed under fire, would become standard doctrine for future Pacific operations. By noon, the beach had become a killing field littered with burning vehicles and wounded men. Medical personnel worked frantically to evacuate casualties, while under constant fire from Japanese positions that seemed to multiply rather than diminish as the battle progressed. The optimistic predictions of a swift victory had evaporated in the face of a defensive system unlike anything American forces had previously encountered. Yet this was just the beginning. The real horror lay ahead in climbing the mountain that dominated everything, Mount Suribachi. The second day of battle dawned grey and cold over Iwo Jima on February 20th, 1945, revealing the full scope of the previous day's carnage. Burning vehicles littered the black sand beaches, while hundreds of wounded Marines awaited evacuation to hospital ships offshore. The optimistic predictions of a swift victory had died with the first salvos of Japanese artillery, replaced by the grim realization that every yard of progress would cost American blood. Among the Marines preparing for another day of hell was Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 27th Marines. At 32, Basilone was already a living legend in the Marine Corps, having earned the Medal of Honor during the desperate fighting at Guadalcanal on October 24th and 25th, 1942. His heroic defense of Henderson Field against overwhelming Japanese attacks had made him the first enlisted Marine to receive America's highest decoration for valor in World War II. After Guadalcanal, the Marine Corps had recalled Basilone from combat duty for a war bond tour across the United States. For months, he traveled from city to city, selling bonds and telling audiences about Marine courage in the Pacific. The publicity tour made him wealthy and famous, but it also made him miserable. While his brothers fought and died on distant islands, he found himself trapped in a world of speeches and ceremonies. Basilone had repeatedly requested return to combat duty, finally convincing his superiors to send him back to the Pacific. Now, crouched behind a sand embankment on Iwo Jima with his machine gun section, he had the opportunity he had demanded. The legend of Manila John Basilone was about to reach its final chapter on the blood-soaked volcanic sand of the deadliest beach in Marine Corps history. Charlie Company faced an immediate crisis as the second day began. Japanese machine gun positions, concealed in reinforced bunkers, had pinned down the entire company short of the airfield, their primary objective for the day. The hidden fortifications had survived the massive preliminary bombardment completely intact, their steel doors and concrete walls protecting the gun crews inside from even direct hits by naval artillery. Basilone studied the terrain ahead, identifying the muzzle flashes that marked enemy positions. His experience at Guadalcanal had taught him to recognize the tactical situation instantly. The company was caught in a carefully planned killing zone with no flanking routes available. The only way forward was a direct assault against positions that had been specifically designed to massacre attacking infantry. Without waiting for orders, Basilone gathered his machine gun crew and prepared to attack the nearest bunker. He had brought along a satchel charge, 20 pounds of TNT in a canvas bag that could destroy even reinforced concrete if placed correctly. The plan was simple and desperate: approach the enemy position under fire and detonate the explosive charge before the Japanese could stop him. Basilone made his break from the sand embankment, sprinting through a hurricane of machine gun fire toward the enemy position. Bullets kicked up geysers of volcanic sand around his feet as he covered the distance to the bunker in what felt like hours but lasted only seconds. Reaching the concrete wall, he tossed the satchel charge through the firing port and took cover as the explosion shattered the position. With the machine gun silenced, the rest of Charlie Company moved forward toward the airfield. But Basilone spotted a Sherman tank that had made it off the beach but was now stuck in a minefield, surrounded by Japanese anti-tank guns. The tank crew was trapped inside their vehicle, unable to move forward or backward while enemy shells exploded around them. Once again, Basilone acted without hesitation. He ran across the open ground to the stranded Sherman and began directing the driver through the minefield, guiding the massive vehicle step by step through the maze of buried explosives. Artillery and mortar shells fell around the tank as Basilone helped navigate it to safety, somehow avoiding both the mines and the enemy fire that sought to destroy them both. After successfully leading the tank to safety, Basilone returned to his men who were still pinned down on the edge of the airfield. Another Japanese strongpoint was raking Charlie Company with enfilading fire, making any advance impossible. Gathering his machine gun section around him, Basilone prepared to lead them in a final assault across the open ground. The attack began with Basilone leading his men toward the enemy strongpoint, his Thompson submachine gun ready for action. Halfway across the airfield, Japanese machine gun fire cut him down instantly, killing the Medal of Honor recipient where he fell. He would be posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, becoming the only enlisted Marine in World War II to receive both of America's highest decorations for valor. Word that Manila John got it spread through the 27th Marines like wildfire, creating shock waves that reached far beyond Charlie Company. If a legendary Marine like Basilone could be killed so easily, what hope did ordinary riflemen have against the Japanese defences? Yet his death also inspired others to acts of equal courage, as Marines throughout the regiment resolved to honour their fallen hero by continuing the attack. Meanwhile, on the northern end of the landing beach, the 3rd Battalion of the 25th Marine Regiment was experiencing its own nightmare in the rock quarry. This natural amphitheatre, carved from volcanic rock by centuries of wind and erosion, provided perfect observation and fields of fire for Japanese defenders, while offering attacking Marines no cover whatsoever. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Chambers had landed with 900 men the previous morning. By the afternoon of the 20th, only 150 remained combat effective. The quarry represented a crucial tactical position that had to be captured to secure the northern flank of the landing beach. Its terraced walls rose in sheer cliffs that channeled any assault into predictable routes, allowing Japanese machine gunners and mortar crews to concentrate their fire with devastating effect. Most ominously, the defenders had positioned 320mm spigot mortars throughout the quarry, weapons the Americans had never encountered in such numbers. These massive Type 98 mortars fired 600-pound rocket bombs that created 8-foot craters wherever they landed. Marines watched in horror as the enormous projectiles arched through the air toward their positions, earning them the nickname Flying Ash Cans for their resemblance to garbage containers. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical damage. Men who survived direct artillery hits often broke down completely after experiencing the terror of the giant mortars. Lieutenant Colonel Chambers had lost his shorefire control party in the first Japanese barrage, eliminating his ability to call in naval gunfire support against the entrenched enemy positions. Without artillery support, his Marines were forced to assault the quarry walls using nothing but personal weapons and individual courage. The attack had begun promisingly, with the first wave reaching the initial terrace, only to discover that the Japanese had blasted multiple cave entrances into the rock walls. Each cave entrance concealed machine gun positions and mortar crews that could fire on the Marines from multiple angles. As soon as American troops cleared one position, defenders would emerge from other caves to reoccupy the ground behind them. The interconnected cave system meant that every foot of progress had to be won multiple times, with Marines finding themselves under fire from positions they thought they had already neutralized. Chambers radioed General Holland Smith's headquarters repeatedly, requesting immediate reinforcement and fire support. His reports described men catching all hell from the quarry and desperately needing support. But the warships offshore could not provide accurate fire support without spotting coordinates, and the available aircraft were committed to other targets around the island. The Marines trapped in the quarry had to endure not only enemy fire, but also the unique horror of Iwo Jima's volcanic terrain. Sulfur fumes bubbled up from cracks in the ground, burning exposed skin and making breathing difficult. The volcanic sand retained heat from underground thermal activity, scalding Marines who pressed their bodies against it for cover. Some positions became literally unbearable, as sulfur gas made soldiers violently sick, while enemy fire prevented them from moving to safer ground. Individual acts of heroism multiplied as the situation became desperate. Corpsmen crawled across open ground under machine gun fire to reach wounded Marines, often becoming casualties themselves in the process. Squad leaders organized small unit assaults against specific cave entrances, knowing that success would likely cost them their lives. Radio operators maintained communication with higher headquarters, despite being prime targets for Japanese snipers who recognized the importance of disrupting American coordination. While the massacre continued in the rock quarry, Marines across the island were developing new tactics to deal with the unprecedented defensive system they faced. The technique that proved most effective became known as corkscrew and blowtorch, a coordinated assault combining explosive charges with flamethrowers to clear Japanese bunkers. Chuck Lindbergh of Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, carried 72 pounds of jellied gasoline in a pressurized tank strapped to his back. As part of a two-man flamethrower crew, his job was to deliver molten fire directly into enemy positions, while his partner provided covering fire and explosive charges. The work required approaching within 20 feet of Japanese machine gun nests, close enough to see the enemy's faces before burning them alive. The tactic required precise coordination and extraordinary courage from all participants. Riflemen with Browning automatic rifles provided suppressive fire against the target bunker while the flamethrower team maneuvered into position. At the crucial moment, covering fire would intensify to keep Japanese heads down, while Lindbergh approached the firing port with his weapon ready. The M2 flamethrower shot molten gasoline up to 50 yards, but maximum effectiveness required much closer range. Lindbergh would sprint to within 20 feet of the enemy position before squeezing the trigger, sending a stream of burning fuel directly into the bunker's interior. The heat was so intense that ammunition stored inside would begin cooking off immediately, while the flames consumed all available oxygen within seconds. After clearing the bunker with fire, Lindbergh's partner would run forward to toss a satchel charge through the firing port, ensuring that nothing inside survived the assault. The explosion would collapse the position permanently, preventing its reoccupation through the underground tunnel system. Only then would the rest of the platoon move forward to continue the advance toward the next objective. Lindbergh repeated this deadly work throughout the battle, clearing multiple Japanese positions as the Marines slowly advanced up Mount Suribachi. His courage under fire earned him the Silver Star, though he would be wounded and evacuated before the mountain fell. The flamethrower tactics he helped develop would become standard procedure for Pacific warfare, saving countless American lives in future operations. As night fell on February 20th, the American forces had made limited but significant progress. The southern airfield was finally in Marine hands, while Mount Suribachi had been isolated from potential reinforcement. Yet the cost had been enormous. American casualties mounted into the thousands during the first 48 hours of fighting, with day one losses alone estimated in the low thousands by various accounts. The night brought new terrors as Japanese aircraft launched a desperate attack against the American fleet offshore. 32 enemy planes, flying from the nearby island of Iwo Jima, approached the carrier task force in the darkness, with kamikaze pilots determined to sink as many ships as possible. The timing was perfect from the Japanese perspective. Most American fighters were grounded for the night, leaving only 6 aircraft available for combat air patrol. Marines on Iwo Jima watched in fascination as anti-aircraft tracers filled the night sky above the fleet. The naval battle was visible from the island, with searchlights probing the darkness while guns of every caliber fired at attacking aircraft. Cecil Gentry, a radio operator on the destroyer escort Lawrence Taylor, monitored radio traffic from the carriers as the attack developed. The kamikaze pilots achieved devastating success against the American carriers. USS Lunga Point was struck by one aircraft that grazed the flight deck, starting a fuel fire that was quickly controlled. But USS Bismarck C was less fortunate, struck by 2 kamikazes in rapid succession. The escort carrier exploded and sank within minutes, becoming the last American carrier lost to enemy action in World War II. Gentry watched one kamikaze fly directly over his ship, so close that he could see the pilot's face in the cockpit. The human moment within the mechanical horror of modern warfare left an indelible impression on the young sailor. The aircraft struck Bismarck Sea seconds later, killing nearly 500 American naval personnel in the explosion and sinking. The night attack demonstrated that Japanese resistance extended far beyond the island itself. Even as Marines fought for every yard of Iwo Jima's volcanic terrain, enemy forces throughout the region continued to threaten American operations with conventional and suicide attacks. The battle was becoming a test of endurance as much as courage, with both sides suffering losses that could not be sustained indefinitely. As dawn approached on February 21st, Marine commanders prepared for another day of brutal fighting against an enemy that showed no signs of weakening. The capture of Mount Suribachi remained the immediate priority. Its commanding position over the landing beaches made continued operations impossible until the volcano fell to American forces. On February 23rd, a 40-man patrol would climb Mount Suribachi. What they did at the top would become the most famous image of World War II, but 3 of the 6 men in that photograph would be dead within days. Dawn on February 23rd, 1945, broke clear and cold over Iwo Jima, revealing Mount Suribachi shrouded in morning mist. For 4 days, the 28th Marine Regiment had clawed their way up the volcanic slopes, paying for every yard with American blood. The extinct cinder cone had become a symbol of Japanese resistance. As long as enemy guns commanded the landing beaches from its heights, the invasion remained vulnerable to counterattack. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 28th Marines, studied the mountain through his binoculars from his command post near its base. Intelligence reports suggested that Japanese resistance was finally crumbling after days of relentless assault by flamethrower teams and demolition squads. The complex network of caves and tunnels that honeycombed the mountain had been systematically cleared, though at enormous cost to the attacking Marines. Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, had borne the brunt of the fighting during the previous day's assault. Captain Dave Severance's men had suffered approximately 30% casualties while advancing up the treacherous slopes under constant fire from hidden Japanese positions. Yet they had persevered, using the deadly corkscrew and blowtorch tactics that combined flamethrowers, demolition charges, and small unit coordination to clear enemy strongpoints. Johnson decided to test Japanese strength with a reconnaissance patrol rather than another costly frontal assault. If the enemy had truly been weakened, a small group might be able to reach the summit and determine whether the mountain could be captured without further massive casualties. At 8:45 in the morning, Johnson called Captain Severance to his command post and issued his orders. "Send a patrol to the top," he commanded. "If you get up there, put this up." The colonel handed Severance a small American flag that had been salvaged from a damaged landing craft. Severance selected his executive officer, Lieutenant Harold Schreier, to lead the patrol. Schreier gathered 40 Marines from Easy Company's 3rd Platoon, including Sergeant Henry Hansen, and several volunteers who had survived the brutal fighting of the previous 4 days. The patrol began its ascent at 9:30, moving cautiously up the volcanic slopes in single file. Each Marine carried a full load of ammunition and grenades, expecting fierce resistance from Japanese positions that had survived the prolonged bombardment. They threw demolition charges into every cave entrance and carefully checked each abandoned bunker for hidden defenders. Surprisingly, the patrol met no organized opposition during their climb. Occasional sniper fire forced them to take cover, and they discovered evidence of recent Japanese occupation in several positions, but no coordinated defense materialized. The devastating assault of the previous days had apparently succeeded in breaking Japanese resistance on the mountain. At about 10:15 to 10:30 in the morning, Lieutenant Shrier's patrol reached the rim of Suribachi's crater. The Marines spread out to secure the area, while Shrier and Sergeant Hansen located a suitable spot for the flag. Finding a length of Japanese pipe among the debris, they attached Colonel Johnson's flag and raised it above the highest point of the mountain. The sight of the stars and stripes flying over Mount Suribachi electrified every American on Iwo Jima. Marines on the beaches below cheered and whistled, while naval vessels offshore sounded their horns in celebration. For the first time since the invasion began, it seemed possible that the nightmare might actually end in American victory. The celebration proved premature. Private Harold Keller spotted a Japanese sniper emerging from a cave entrance near the summit, taking aim at the flag-raising party. Keller quickly fired 3 shots from his Monet rifle, killing the enemy soldier before he could fire. Immediately afterward, Japanese soldiers emerged from the same cave and began lobbing grenades at the Marines. A brief but vicious firefight erupted on the summit as the patrol took cover behind volcanic rocks and returned fire. The engagement lasted only minutes, demonstrating that Japanese resistance had not been completely eliminated. When the shooting stopped, several enemy soldiers lay dead, while the American patrol had suffered no casualties. News of the successful flag-raising reached the command ships offshore within minutes. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, who had accompanied the invasion fleet, was coming ashore with General Holland Smith when he spotted the American flag on Mount Suribachi. Turning to the general, Forrestal remarked that the raising of that flag meant a Marine Corps for the next 500 years. More significantly, Forrestal immediately decided he wanted the flag as a personal souvenir. The Navy Secretary ordered General Smith to secure the banner so it could be taken back to Washington as a memento. Smith dutifully radioed Lieutenant Colonel Johnson, with instructions to send the flag down to the beach. Johnson's reaction to this demand was immediate and profane. After listening to the radio message, he responded that the flag belonged to the men of his battalion who had died capturing the mountain. No politician would be taking it as a trophy while Marines were still fighting and dying. Instead, Johnson sent his adjutant to retrieve a larger replacement flag from the beachhead supply dump. The second flag, measuring 8 feet by 4 feet 8 inches, was significantly larger than the original banner. Johnson's instructions to his messenger were characteristically direct. And make it a bigger one, so every son of a bitch on this whole island can see it. At around 12:30 to 1 o'clock in the afternoon, company runner René Gagnon climbed Mount Suribachi, carrying the replacement flag. He found Sergeant Mike Strank and delivered Johnson's message about running up the big flag so everyone on the island could see it. The original flag would be carefully preserved for the battalion, while the larger banner would serve as the visible symbol of American conquest. 6 men from Easy Company gathered to raise the second flag. According to investigations conducted by the Marine Corps in 1947, 2016, and 2019, the identities in the famous photograph were later revised as historical research continued. They found a heavy steel pipe among the Japanese debris and began mounting the flag for maximum visibility across the island. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal, who had survived the horrific first day of fighting, happened to be climbing Mount Suribachi when the second flag raising began. Rosenthal had been documenting the battle since February 19th, capturing images of Marine heroism that would help Americans understand the true cost of Pacific victory. His presence at this moment was pure chance. As the Marines struggled to raise the heavy pole against the Pacific wind, Rosenthal quickly set up his camera equipment. The photographer had only seconds to compose and focus before the moment would pass forever. At precisely the right instant, as the flag began to unfurl, Rosenthal pressed his shutter and captured what would become the most famous image of World War II. The photograph perfectly captured the essence of American determination and sacrifice in the Pacific War. 6 young men straining together to plant their nation's flag on enemy soil, their faces hidden but their purpose unmistakable. The image would soon appear on the front page of virtually every newspaper in America, becoming an instant symbol of victory and hope. Yet the human cost behind that iconic image was already mounting. 3 of the 6 Marines in Rosenthal's photograph would be killed in action within days of the flag raising. Their deaths would transform the image from a symbol of triumph into a memorial for the young men who died bringing freedom to the Pacific. Rosenthal's photograph achieved its maximum impact when it appeared in American newspapers on February 25th. The image provided exactly what the American home front needed during a period of mounting casualties and war weariness: visual proof that American forces were winning decisive victories. The flag raising became shorthand for American determination and ultimate triumph, even as the battle for Iwo Jima continued with undiminished ferocity. President Franklin Roosevelt immediately recognized the photograph's propaganda value and ordered the 3 surviving flag raisers returned to the United States for a war bond campaign. Their reluctant participation would raise over $26 billion for the war effort, while turning them into reluctant celebrities. The flag raising also provided crucial morale for Marines still fighting on Iwo Jima. Mount Suribachi's capture eliminated the Japanese observation post that had made life miserable for everyone on the invasion beaches. Supply operations could now proceed safely, medical evacuations became less dangerous, and reinforcements could land without being subjected to observed artillery fire. Yet, the strategic significance of Suribachi's fall was limited. The mountain had been isolated from the main Japanese defensive system since the first day of fighting, making its capture more symbolic than tactically decisive. The real strength of Lieutenant General Kuribayashi's defense lay in the elaborate tunnel systems and fortified positions of northern Iwo Jima, where 20,000 Japanese troops waited in prepared positions. As night fell on February 23rd, Marines throughout the southern portion of Iwo Jima could see the American flag flying proudly over Mount Suribachi. The sight provided desperately needed encouragement for men who had endured 4 days of unprecedented casualties and combat intensity. For the first time since landing, victory seemed possible rather than merely hoped for. The flag was raised, but the battle was far from over. As the Marines celebrated, they had no idea they were about to enter the most brutal phase of Pacific warfare, a place both sides would call the meat grinder. With Mount Suribachi's American flag visible across the southern end of Iwo Jima, Marine commanders turned their attention to the island's northern sectors, where the real battle was about to begin. The volcanic cone had been a symbol of Japanese resistance, but Lieutenant General Kuribayashi had never intended it as his primary defensive position. The mountain's isolation from his main forces had made its fall inevitable. The true test of American resolve lay ahead in the broken terrain and elaborate fortifications of northern Iwo Jima. February 24th dawned with a deceptive calm as the 3rd, 4th and 5th Marine Divisions prepared for a coordinated assault across the island's widest point. Intelligence estimates suggested that Japanese resistance had been significantly weakened by 8 days of continuous fighting and enormous casualties. American commanders hoped that one more major push might break enemy morale and bring the campaign to a swift conclusion. They were about to discover just how wrong their optimistic assessments had been. The terrain ahead presented challenges unlike anything American forces had encountered in previous Pacific campaigns. Beyond Iwo Jima's second airfield lay the Motoyama Plateau, a flat, open area completely devoid of natural cover, and surrounded by commanding ridgelines that provided perfect fields of fire for defending forces. Every approach to this killing ground was covered by interlocking machine gun positions, mortar crews, and anti-tank guns that had been precisely sighted during months of preparation. On the plateau's eastern flank rose Hill 382, a small mountain that had been hollowed out like a fortress to conceal artillery pieces and anti-tank guns. Japanese engineers had spent the winter of 1944 blasting caves and tunnels throughout the hill's interior, creating a subterranean stronghold that could house entire battalions while remaining invisible to American reconnaissance. The hill's reverse slopes contained concealed gun positions that could engage American forces from unexpected angles, making direct assault nearly suicidal. To the west, an enormous rock formation that Marines would christen Turkey Knob served as the Japanese communications headquarters for the entire northern defense sector. This natural fortress contained radio equipment, telephone switchboards, and command centers buried so deeply that even direct hits from battleship guns could not penetrate to the vital installations within. From Turkey Knob, enemy commanders could coordinate defensive fires and direct reinforcements through the extensive tunnel network that connected every major position. The tunnel system itself represented the most sophisticated defensive engineering that American forces had yet encountered in the Pacific War. Unlike the relatively simple cave complexes of previous campaigns, Kuribayashi's northern defenses featured multiple levels of interconnected passages that allowed defenders to move between positions without ever exposing themselves to observation or fire. Some tunnels descended more than 70 feet below ground level, providing protection against even the heaviest naval bombardment while maintaining communication links between scattered strong points. These underground networks meant that American forces could never be certain they had truly captured any position. Bunkers that appeared destroyed could be reoccupied within hours through concealed tunnel entrances, forcing Marines to fight for the same ground repeatedly. The psychological effect was devastating. Even experienced combat veterans began to question whether progress was possible against an enemy that seemed to materialize from the volcanic rock itself. The assault on northern Iwo Jima began at 6:30 on the morning of February 25th, with the 4th Marine Division jumping off toward the 2nd Airfield. The 23rd, 24th, and 25th Marine Regiments advanced in coordinated waves, supported by Sherman tanks and preceded by the heaviest artillery barrage the Corps could deliver. For the first few hundred yards, the attack proceeded according to plan, as Marines crossed the airfield's open runways and taxi areas without serious opposition. Then, Kuribayashi's main defensive line revealed itself with devastating suddenness. Japanese mortars, artillery, and machine guns that had remained silent during the bombardment opened fire simultaneously, creating a hurricane of steel that swept across the advancing Americans. The 3rd Battalion of the 24th Marines, which had been making good progress across the airfield, found themselves caught in the open with nowhere to hide, as enemy shells exploded around them with scientific precision. The Sherman tanks that had been providing mobile fire support became primary targets for Japanese anti-tank guns, positioned throughout the surrounding ridgelines. Within minutes, 5 Shermans had been knocked out by accurate fire from 47mm guns that could penetrate American armor at ranges up to 800 yards. The surviving tank crews found themselves trapped in a deadly crossfire, unable to advance or withdraw, while enemy gunners methodically destroyed their vehicles one by one. American commanders quickly realized they faced a defensive system unlike anything encountered in previous Pacific operations. Rather than the conventional bunker lines that could be breached through concentrated assault, Kuribayashi had created a grid of mutually supporting positions that covered every possible approach route. No Marine could move anywhere on the Motoyama Plateau without being observed and engaged by multiple enemy weapons simultaneously. The Marines, who managed to reach the northern edge of the airfield, found themselves clinging to a narrow strip of captured ground while Japanese fire swept the open areas behind them. Reinforcements could not advance across the killing field, ammunition and medical supplies could not be brought forward, and wounded men lay exposed in the open, while enemy snipers made evacuation attempts deadly for corpsmen and stretcher-bearers. By noon, the entire 4th Division attack had ground to a halt just beyond the airfield's northern boundary. The terrain itself seemed designed to maximize American casualties while minimizing Japanese exposure to counterfire. The plateau's flat surface offered no natural cover, forcing Marines to create fighting positions by piling up volcanic rocks and debris under constant enemy observation. Meanwhile, the surrounding ridges provided Japanese defenders with perfect concealment and commanding fields of fire that made accurate return fire almost impossible for the Americans trapped in the open ground below. Both sides quickly recognized this area's unique character and began referring to it by the same nickname, the meat grinder. American and Japanese alike understood that this terrain would consume enormous numbers of troops from both armies before either side achieved decisive results. The question was not whether the position could be taken, but whether the Americans could afford the casualties necessary to capture it. Marine Corps commanders responded to the crisis by rushing their most effective weapons to the northern front. 8 specially modified M4A3 Sherman tanks, nicknamed Zippo and Ronson tanks for their flamethrower armament, were brought forward to deal with the Japanese bunker complexes that conventional weapons could not penetrate. These vehicles carried Navy Mark I flamethrower equipment instead of their normal 75mm guns, though other flame systems and man-carried flamethrower units also supported the assault. The flamethrower tanks represented a revolutionary approach to Pacific warfare that had been developed specifically for operations against heavily fortified Japanese positions. Each vehicle carried enough napalm fuel for approximately 60 seconds of continuous firing, though tactical employment typically involved short bursts directed at specific targets. The psychological effect of these weapons often proved as valuable as their destructive power. Few Japanese soldiers could maintain effective resistance while being burned alive in their fighting positions. Marine accounts consistently praised the effectiveness of these specialized weapons against Japanese defensive positions. The flame tanks proved capable of neutralizing bunkers that had survived direct hits from naval gunfire and aerial bombing. However, with only 8 such vehicles available for the entire northern assault, most Marine attacks had to proceed without their devastating support. The tactical employment of flamethrower tanks required careful coordination between armor and infantry units. A typical assault would begin with a conventionally armed Sherman using its 75mm gun to blast a hole in the target bunker's outer wall. The gun-armed tank would then withdraw, while the flamethrower Sherman moved forward to shoot burning napalm through the opening, ensuring complete destruction of everything inside the fortification. This corkscrew and blowtorch tactic proved highly effective against individual positions, but the sheer number of Japanese strongpoints meant that progress remained painfully slow. Each bunker had to be located, approached under fire, and systematically destroyed while enemy forces in adjacent positions provided covering fire for their comrades. The process consumed enormous quantities of time, ammunition, and American lives, while advancing the front lines only a few yards at a time. The scale of flamethrower operations on Iwo Jima exceeded anything previously attempted in Pacific warfare. During periods of intense fighting, Marine forces were expending approximately 10,000 gallons of napalm fuel per day in their efforts to clear Japanese defensive positions throughout the northern sectors. This massive consumption rate during active operations quickly exhausted available supplies, forcing urgent requests for additional fuel shipments from rear area depots. The logistical challenge of maintaining such operations added another layer of complexity to an already difficult tactical situation. Individual Marines throughout the Northern Campaign continued to display the extraordinary courage that had characterized the entire Iwo Jima operation. Chuck Lindbergh, the flamethrower operator who had earned a Silver Star during the Mount Suribachi assault, was wounded and evacuated during the early stages of the northern fighting. His injury demonstrated the extreme dangers faced by flamethrower crews, who had to approach within 20 feet of enemy positions while carrying 72 pounds of highly flammable equipment on their backs. The human cost of the Northern Campaign became apparent within days of its beginning. Sergeant Mike Strank, one of the 6 Marines immortalized in Joe Rosenthal's flag-raising photograph, was killed by enemy artillery fire on March 1st, while directing his platoon during an assault on Japanese positions. Corporal Harlan Block, another of the famous flag-raisers, died the same day when a mortar shell exploded near his position during the continuing advance toward Hill 382. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, who had ordered the flag raised on Mount Suribachi and defied Secretary Forrestal's demand for it as a souvenir, was killed in a Japanese artillery barrage while directing his men at the front lines. Johnson's death eliminated one of the most effective battalion commanders in the 28th Marine Regiment at a time when experienced leadership was desperately needed for the continuing assault. His loss was felt throughout the regiment as Marines realized that even their most competent officers were not immune to the random violence of modern warfare. The Japanese experience of this grinding battle was characterized by desperate attempts to maintain communication and supply lines despite overwhelming American firepower. Individual defenders throughout the tunnel complexes struggled to coordinate their resistance while being systematically isolated and destroyed by advancing Marine forces. Personal accounts from survivors describe the terror of living underground for weeks, while American flamethrowers and explosives methodically cleared the positions above them. Meanwhile, American engineers worked around the clock to repair Iwo Jima's southern airfield for use by damaged B-29 superfortresses returning from bombing missions over mainland Japan. Despite the continuing battle raging across the northern half of the island, over 2,000 Seabees laboured to make the runway operational within a week of its capture. Their efforts were rewarded on March 4th when a crippled B-29, using the call sign Dynamite, requested emergency landing permission while returning from a mission over Tokyo. The successful emergency landing provided a tremendous morale boost for Marines who could see tangible evidence that their sacrifice was producing strategic results. Dynamite's crew leaped from their aircraft and kissed the ground while shouting appreciation for the Marines who had captured the airfield. The facility would eventually accommodate approximately 2,251 B-29 landings during and after the battle, though many of these were routine refueling stops rather than life-threatening emergencies. The strategic value of providing emergency landing facilities helped justify the enormous cost of capturing Iwo Jima, though the immediate tactical situation remained desperate for Marines fighting in the northern sectors. Every yard of progress required multiple assaults against positions that seemed to multiply rather than diminish as the battle continued. Japanese defenders used their tunnel networks to reoccupy bunkers that Americans thought they had cleared, creating a nightmarish situation where the same ground had to be captured repeatedly. The original American intelligence estimate had catastrophically underestimated Japanese strength on the island. Rather than facing 12,000 defenders as initially believed, Kuribayashi commanded approximately 21,000 troops who had spent months preparing for exactly this type of attritional warfare. Even after weeks of brutal fighting and enormous casualties on both sides, thousands of Japanese soldiers remained hidden in the extensive tunnel systems, determined to resist to the death. The grinding nature of the Northern Campaign differed fundamentally from previous Pacific operations, where American forces could typically achieve breakthrough and exploitation after breaking enemy defensive lines. On Iwo Jima, there were no rear areas to exploit, and no opportunities for rapid advances that could unhinge Japanese resistance. Every position had to be taken through direct assault against defenders who preferred death to surrender, and who had spent months preparing for exactly this type of attritional warfare. The psychological toll on American forces was enormous, as Marines began to question whether victory was possible against such determined opposition. Combat fatigue casualties increased dramatically, as men who had survived weeks of continuous fighting found themselves unable to continue functioning under the constant stress of the Northern Campaign. Medical personnel reported unprecedented numbers of psychiatric casualties among troops who had previously shown no signs of combat exhaustion. Yet American forces continued to adapt their tactics and improve their effectiveness against the Japanese defensive system. Small unit leaders developed techniques for clearing bunkers that minimized casualties while maximizing destructive effect against enemy positions. Artillery forward observers learned to coordinate their fires more effectively with advancing infantry, while naval gunfire support became increasingly accurate as spotters gained experience directing shipboard weapons against inland targets. By March 8th, the Japanese secondary defensive line was finally cracking under the sustained pressure of American assault forces equipped with improved tactics and adequate flamethrower support. Hill 382 had been partially overrun, Turkey Knob was under direct assault, and the Motoyama Plateau had been cleared of most enemy strongpoints. For the first time since the Northern Campaign began, American commanders could see the possibility of decisive breakthrough that might bring the battle to a swift conclusion. But Captain Ano and his subordinates had a desperate plan, one final massive banzai attack that would either save Iwo Jima or destroy what remained of its defenders. By early March 1945, the Japanese secondary defensive line across northern Iwo Jima was beginning to buckle under relentless American pressure. Hill 382 had been partially overrun after days of costly assaults. Turkey Knob was under siege by flame tanks and demolition teams, and the Motoyama Plateau had been cleared of most enemy strongpoints. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi watched his carefully constructed defensive system crumble piece by piece, knowing that each lost position brought American forces closer to final victory. The 3rd Marine Division under Major General Graves Erskine faced one remaining obstacle that had defied all previous attempts at capture. Hill 362C, a dominating volcanic formation overlooking a sulphurous field, commanded approaches to the final Japanese defensive positions in the island's northern reaches. Previous frontal assaults against this stronghold had failed with enormous casualties, despite overwhelming artillery support and coordinated airstrikes. The hill's defensive advantages seemed insurmountable to conventional assault tactics. Japanese positions had been blasted into the reverse slopes, where they remained invisible to American observation, while providing perfect fields of fire against any approaching enemy forces. Multiple tunnel entrances allowed defenders to reinforce threatened sectors while evacuating personnel from positions under direct attack. Most critically, the approaches to Hill 362C crossed open ground, where Marines had to advance through sulfur fumes that burned exposed skin and made breathing difficult. General Erskine recognized that conventional tactics had proven inadequate against this particular objective and decided to employ a radical new approach. Rather than beginning with the customary preparatory bombardment that had become standard doctrine for Pacific amphibious operations, he ordered his assault forces to attack without any preliminary artillery fire whatsoever. The strategy was based on his observation that Japanese defenders invariably retreated deep into their tunnel complexes during bombardments before returning to man their positions when American infantry advanced. In the pre-dawn hours of March 6th, the 9th and 21st Marine Regiments left their foxholes and moved silently across the battlefield toward Hill 362C. Strict radio silence had been ordered to prevent Japanese monitoring stations from detecting the approaching assault. Marines advanced through the darkness, using hand signals and whispered commands, moving more quietly than they had ever thought possible in combat conditions. The surprise proved complete beyond American expectations. When the 1st Marines reached Japanese defensive positions, they found enemy soldiers fast asleep at their posts, completely unaware that American forces had approached within yards of their bunkers. Marines used bayonets and combat knives to eliminate sentries silently before continuing toward what they believed was Hill 362C's summit. The assault force continued climbing through the darkness, encountering minimal resistance from Japanese defenders who were caught completely off guard by the unexpected attack. Individual enemy soldiers were overcome before they could raise any alarm, while larger positions were cleared using grenades and small arms fire that was muffled by the volcanic terrain. By dawn, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Boehm's 3rd Battalion of the 9th Marines had reached what appeared to be their objective and was preparing to consolidate their stunning victory. Daylight revealed the full extent of both American success and failure. The Marines had indeed captured a significant hill through their daring night assault, but morning light showed that they had stormed the wrong objective entirely. In the darkness and confusion of the approach march, the assault force had advanced 250 yards in the wrong direction and captured a different hill, while Hill 362C remained in Japanese hands. The mistake created an immediate crisis for the entire 3rd Marine Division. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 9th Regiment, which had been advancing toward Hill 362C in coordination with the night assault, now found themselves caught in the open by fully alert Japanese defenders who had been awakened by the sounds of fighting on the adjacent hill. Enemy machine guns and mortars that should have been suppressed by the capture of Hill 362C instead opened devastating fire on Marines trapped without cover in the sulphurous terrain below. Lieutenant Colonel Boehm immediately recognized both the tactical opportunity and the desperate situation facing his division. While his battalion had captured the wrong objective, their early morning success had created a salient that could be used to relieve pressure on the other Marine units now pinned down in the open. He ordered an immediate assault against the actual Hill 362C, while Japanese defenders were still reacting to the unexpected development of fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. The attack on Hill 362C benefited enormously from the confusion created by the earlier assault on the adjacent hill. Japanese defensive fires were divided between multiple threats, while American artillery and naval gunfire could finally be brought to bear against positions that were no longer concealed by the element of surprise. More importantly, the unintended capture of the neighbouring hill had provided American forces with observation posts and fire support positions that could suppress enemy strongpoints during the assault. During the fighting on March 6th and 7th, both hills were finally secured despite the confusion and casualties of the morning assault. The accidental nature of the initial success did not diminish its tactical significance. Hill 362C had finally fallen after weeks of bloody failure, opening the approaches to Kuribayashi's final defensive positions. More importantly, the successful surprise attack had demonstrated that Japanese defenders could be overcome when American forces abandoned predictable assault patterns in favor of innovative tactics. The loss of Hill 362C marked the beginning of the end for organized Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima. With their secondary defensive line finally broken and American forces advancing from multiple directions simultaneously, Japanese unit commanders faced the prospect of inevitable defeat within days rather than weeks. The carefully constructed defensive system that had consumed so many American lives was finally collapsing under the cumulative weight of sustained assault. This strategic reality created a crisis of leadership among Japanese commanders who had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi had forbidden banzai charges throughout the campaign, insisting that his men preserve their lives as long as possible to inflict maximum casualties on American forces. His subordinate officers had obeyed these orders during the defensive fighting, but the prospect of certain defeat, without the possibility of honorable death in battle, proved psychologically challenging for many professional soldiers. Captain Samaji Inoue and General Senda, commanding elements of the naval garrison and army units respectively, began planning a massive banzai attack without Kuribayashi's knowledge or approval. They believed that only a coordinated assault by all remaining Japanese forces could possibly reverse the tactical situation and restore honor to their units. If the attack failed, at least they would die as warriors rather than being systematically exterminated in their underground positions. The planning for this forbidden assault began in secret during the night of March 7th, as Japanese commanders throughout the northern defensive sector received coded messages instructing them to prepare their men for a general attack. Nearly 1,000 soldiers from various units, naval air groups, army infantry, artillery crews, and support personnel were told to destroy their equipment and prepare for one final assault against American positions. Many of these men were not trained infantry and had spent the entire campaign operating radios, maintaining weapons, or providing logistical support from underground installations. Individual Japanese soldiers reacted to these orders with what survivor accounts suggest was a mixture of relief, terror, and resignation. Months of living underground, while being systematically hunted by American flamethrower teams, had created psychological pressures that may have made death in battle seem preferable to continued existence in the tunnel systems. Personal accounts from the few survivors describe conditions that were becoming increasingly unbearable as American forces methodically cleared positions above them. At the Naval Air Group Command Bunker, radio operators and maintenance personnel prepared to abandon their technical duties for the unfamiliar role of assault infantry. Many of these men had never been trained for ground combat and carried only basic weapons, rifles, grenades, and the traditional samurai swords that Japanese officers still wore as symbols of their warrior heritage. They were ordered to hide grenades in their belts to detonate among their captors should they be taken prisoner, as surrender was considered a fate worse than death for Japanese military personnel. The assault was scheduled to begin at midnight on March 8th, with units moving independently toward their assigned objectives. Japanese commanders hoped to achieve tactical surprise by attacking during hours when American forces typically maintained only skeleton crews in forward positions. The plan called for infiltration through areas that had been bypassed during recent Marine advances, followed by coordinated attacks against command posts, artillery positions, and supply dumps throughout the American rear areas. However, intelligence about the planned attack had reached American commanders through intercepted radio transmissions and prisoner interrogations. The 4th Marine Division had noticed increased Japanese activity during daylight hours and issued warnings to all subordinate units about the possibility of a nighttime assault. Forward observers were placed on maximum alert, while artillery crews prepared defensive fires that could be called down immediately if enemy movement was detected in the disputed areas. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi learned of the unauthorized banzai preparations and attempted to prevent their execution. Radio messages sent from his command bunker explicitly forbade the attack and ordered all units to remain in their defensive positions, but many formations had already destroyed their communications equipment in preparation for the assault. Those commanders who received Kuribayashi's orders found themselves torn between loyalty to their general and pressure from subordinates who demanded the opportunity to die with honor. The attack began shortly after midnight, with approximately 1,000 Japanese soldiers emerging from hidden tunnel entrances throughout the northern sectors of Iwo Jima. Many assault groups became lost in the darkness and confusion of moving across terrain that had been devastated by weeks of artillery fire and aerial bombardment. Communication between units broke down immediately as planned coordination gave way to individual acts of desperate courage by small groups of soldiers who had accepted death as inevitable. American defensive fires opened almost immediately as Marine sentries spotted movement in areas that should have been empty of enemy personnel. Mortar crews who had pre-registered their weapons on likely approach routes began firing illumination rounds that revealed Japanese soldiers advancing across open ground in large numbers. Artillery, forward observers called in defensive fires that had been planned specifically for this type of situation, creating killing zones across every possible infiltration route. The majority of Japanese assault groups were decimated before they could reach American positions. Those units that managed to close with Marine defensive lines found themselves facing alert sentries, supported by automatic weapons, artillery, and naval gunfire that had been called in from ships offshore. Individual acts of courage could not overcome the fundamental tactical disadvantage of attacking prepared positions with improvised forces that lacked adequate training, coordination, or heavy weapons support. One group of aircraft maintenance personnel, led by a young enlisted man whose technical duties had kept him away from ground combat throughout the campaign, managed to reach an abandoned Shinto shrine near the second airfield before becoming disoriented in the darkness. Finding themselves surrounded by other confused Japanese units who had also lost their way, they took shelter in bomb craters, while American artillery began targeting the area with increasingly accurate fire. Hour after hour passed as these men waited for opportunities to continue their attack while watching their comrades be systematically destroyed by overwhelming enemy firepower. Eventually, this particular group encountered elements of the 26th Tank Regiment, who had maintained better communication with higher headquarters throughout the night. These tank crews informed the surviving assault troops that General Kuribayashi had explicitly forbidden the banzai attack and ordered all units to return to their defensive positions where they could continue resisting American advances through conventional defensive tactics. The revelation that their attack had been unauthorized created confusion and debate among the surviving soldiers. The argument that followed reflected the fundamental tension between military discipline and the warrior ethos that had driven Japanese military culture throughout the Pacific War. Many soldiers felt they had been betrayed by superiors, who had promised them honorable death in battle, but now ordered them to return to the degrading existence of hiding underground while being systematically hunted by American forces. Others recognized that proper military discipline required obedience to their commanding general's orders, regardless of personal desires for glorious death. Ultimately, military discipline prevailed over individual desires for martyrdom. The surviving members of the banzai attack returned to concealed positions, where they would spend the remainder of the battle conducting defensive operations, according to Kuribayashi's original strategy. Of the 100 men in this particular unit who had begun the night assault, estimates suggest only 20 survived to see dawn break over Iwo Jima on March 9th. The overall casualties from the failed Banzai attack reflected the tactical futility of the entire operation. Contemporary American reports counted hundreds of Japanese bodies the following morning, while suffering casualties that various sources estimate between 90 and several hundred personnel, an exchange ratio that demonstrated the effectiveness of prepared defensive positions against uncoordinated infantry assault. More importantly, from a strategic perspective, the failed attack had eliminated many of the most experienced Japanese soldiers who remained capable of conducting effective defensive operations. The tactical and psychological impact of the Banzai failure appears to have marked a significant turning point in the battle for Iwo Jima. While Japanese resistance had been gradually weakening due to cumulative losses and the systematic destruction of defensive positions, the failed night attack may have contributed to further deterioration of morale among surviving defenders. Units that had maintained discipline and fighting effectiveness throughout the campaign began to show increasing signs of disorganization as individual soldiers questioned whether continued resistance served any meaningful purpose. American intelligence officers noted declining Japanese defensive effectiveness following the failed night attack. Positions that had previously been defended with determined resistance were now being abandoned after lighter opposition. Radio intercepts revealed increasing confusion and breakdown of command authority as surviving Japanese officers struggled to maintain control over demoralized troops who had lost confidence in their leadership and their cause. The strategic situation had fundamentally shifted in favor of American forces, who could now advance with confidence that organized Japanese resistance was finally breaking apart after 3 weeks of unprecedented combat intensity. Individual strongpoints would continue to offer determined resistance, and many Japanese soldiers would fight to the death rather than surrender, but the coherent defensive system that had made northern Iwo Jima such a nightmare for attacking Marines was finally disintegrating. With his defensive system crumbling and many of his best remaining troops dead, General Kuribayashi is believed to have withdrawn to the island's northwestern corner for a final stand. The exact circumstances of his final movements and death remain historically uncertain, though American forces would soon encounter their last major resistance in the broken terrain they would name Death Valley. By early March 1945, many Japanese forward positions had been isolated across Iwo Jima, but organized resistance, particularly in the northern volcanic sector, persisted and continued to exact heavy casualties on advancing American forces. The systematic destruction of Kuribayashi's outer defensive network had forced surviving enemy forces into the northwestern corner of the island, but thousands of defenders remained entrenched in a nightmare landscape of volcanic ravines, sulfur-stained rocks, and treacherous gorges that would test the limits of human endurance. American Marines, exhausted after 3 weeks of unprecedented combat, prepared for what they hoped would be the final phase of the bloodiest campaign in Pacific warfare. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi, his carefully constructed defensive system under enormous pressure but not yet completely destroyed, had concentrated remaining forces in this hellish terrain for reasons both tactical and symbolic. The northwestern sector offered natural defensive advantages that could maximize casualties among attacking Americans while prolonging resistance for as long as possible. More importantly, Japanese military tradition demanded that a commanding general die fighting rather than accept the dishonor of capture or suicide in defeat. The terrain itself seemed designed by nature to favor defensive warfare over offensive operations. Deep ravines carved by centuries of volcanic activity created natural killing fields where individual riflemen could hold up entire companies of advancing Marines. Sulfur gas seeping from cracks in the ground made breathing difficult, and burned exposed skin, while the unstable volcanic soil collapsed under the weight of heavy equipment. Most critically, the extensive cave networks that honeycombed this area remained largely intact despite weeks of bombardment, providing concealment for defenders who could emerge without warning to attack American forces. American military leadership, under pressure to demonstrate progress in a campaign that had already cost far more than anticipated, staged an official ceremony on March 14th at the base of Mount Suribachi. A proclamation was read in Admiral Nimitz's name, declaring American occupation of the island, complete with flag-raising ceremonies designed to provide positive news for an American public growing increasingly concerned about the human cost of Pacific operations. However, this mid-March ceremony proved premature, as fierce fighting continued throughout the island's northern sectors for nearly 2 more weeks. Even as Navy photographers captured images of the official flag ceremony, intense combat raged across the volcanic ridgelines, where Marine flame tanks continued, expending thousands of gallons of napalm daily to clear Japanese positions that seemed to multiply rather than diminish. Individual strongpoints that appeared destroyed would be reoccupied within hours through tunnel networks that American forces had not yet discovered or mapped completely. The premature victory ceremony would prove embarrassing, as casualties continued mounting long after the island was officially proclaimed under American control. The human cost of these extended final operations fell heavily on Marines who had survived the earlier phases of the campaign, only to be killed or wounded during what should have been mop-up operations. Private First Class Franklin Sousley, the youngest of the 6 Marines immortalized in Joe Rosenthal's flag-raising photograph, was killed by a Japanese sniper on March 21st, while advancing with his unit toward enemy positions in the northwestern sector. At 19 years old, Sousley had enlisted straight from his Kentucky farm and maintained an optimistic outlook throughout the battle, despite witnessing horrors that would haunt his surviving comrades for decades. Sousley's death marked a grim milestone in the flag raiser's story. 3 of the 6 men in history's most famous war photograph had now been killed within a month of their moment of triumph. Sergeant Mike Strank and Corporal Harlon Block had died earlier in March, leaving only Ira Hayes, Rene Gagnon, and John Bradley to carry the weight of their shared fame. The tragedy of their losses underscored the random nature of survival in modern combat, where courage and experience provided no guarantee against the anonymous violence of artillery shells and sniper bullets. The systematic clearing of Japanese positions continued throughout mid-March, as Marine units employed increasingly sophisticated tactics to root out defenders from their underground sanctuaries. Flamethrower teams worked in coordination with demolition squads to seal cave entrances permanently after burning out their occupants. Combat engineers used shaped charges and explosives to collapse tunnel systems that could not be cleared through conventional assault. Yet progress remained painfully slow, as each position required individual attention and consumed irreplaceable American lives in the process. The psychological toll on both sides reached unprecedented levels during these final weeks of fighting. American Marines, who had endured 3 weeks of continuous combat, found themselves pushed beyond normal human endurance limits. Combat fatigue casualties reached epidemic proportions, as men who had previously shown no signs of breakdown suddenly found themselves unable to function under the constant stress of close-quarters fighting against an enemy that preferred death to surrender. Japanese defenders faced even grimmer circumstances, as their ammunition, food, and medical supplies dwindled to nothing. Personal accounts from the few survivors described conditions in the underground positions that bordered on the medieval. Wounded men dying slowly from infected injuries, soldiers sharing single rifle cartridges, and the constant terror of American flamethrower attacks that could turn cave systems into furnaces within seconds. Yet organized resistance continued despite these horrific conditions, as individual Japanese soldiers maintained discipline under circumstances that would have broken most military units. The persistence of Japanese resistance through late March demonstrated the effectiveness of Kuribayashi's defensive preparations and the determination of his remaining forces. Intelligence reports suggested that thousands of enemy soldiers remained capable of organized combat, despite weeks of systematic destruction of their positions. American commanders realized that final victory would require additional weeks of costly operations to eliminate every pocket of resistance throughout the island's complex terrain. The end came with stunning suddenness on the night of March 25th, when approximately 300 Japanese soldiers emerged from hidden positions throughout the northwestern sector for one final assault against American rear areas. This attack differed fundamentally from the failed Banzai charge of March 8th. Rather than a desperate frontal assault against prepared positions, the March 25th operation represented a carefully planned infiltration that demonstrated remarkable tactical sophistication. How 300 enemy soldiers managed to move undetected through American lines remains one of the most puzzling tactical questions of the entire Pacific War. The infiltration began after midnight as small groups of Japanese soldiers slipped through ravines and gullies that American forces had bypassed during their advance toward the main defensive positions. These men moved with extraordinary stealth across terrain they knew intimately, avoiding American sentries and patrol routes through careful timing and detailed knowledge of marine defensive patterns. Many wore captured American equipment and uniforms to confuse identification during the crucial moments when they would be most vulnerable to detection. The attackers' primary target was a tent encampment near the 2nd Airfield that housed rear echelon troops who were not expecting ground combat. The 5th Pioneer Battalion and various support units had established this camp to process supplies, maintain equipment, and provide rest facilities for Marines rotating out of frontline positions. These men were armed with personal weapons, but lacked the heavy automatic weapons and artillery support that characterized frontline defensive positions. The attack began at approximately 12:30 in the morning, when Japanese soldiers surrounding the camp rose from concealment and charged toward the tented area with loud banzai cries. The assault achieved complete tactical surprise, as American personnel were awakened by the sounds of automatic weapons, fire, and grenade explosions, rather than the usual warnings provided by perimeter guards. Initial confusion was enormous, as support troops struggled to understand what was happening, while enemy soldiers moved among the tents with bayonets, swords, and firearms. First Lieutenant Harry Martin of the 5th Pioneer Battalion demonstrated extraordinary heroism during the opening minutes of the attack, as he organized desperate resistance among his confused and scattered men. Armed only with a pistol, Martin moved through the camp under fire to establish a defensive perimeter that could halt the Japanese assault before it completely overran the rear area installation. His leadership during these crucial moments prevented what could have been a complete massacre of American personnel who were unprepared for ground combat. When Martin realized that enemy soldiers had surrounded and cut off several tents containing members of his unit, he made a decision that would cost him his life but save dozens of his men. Charging alone through intense enemy fire, he fought his way to the isolated Americans and directed their withdrawal to safer positions. Wounded twice during this rescue operation, Martin continued fighting until he reached a captured American machine gun position where 3 Japanese soldiers were turning the weapon against retreating Marines. Martin's final act was a single-handed assault on the machine gun nest that eliminated all 3 enemy soldiers and recaptured the weapon for American use. He was killed instantly by a Japanese grenade during this action, but his sacrifice had broken the back of the enemy attack and allowed the surviving Americans to organize an effective counter-assault. For his actions during the tent camp battle, Lieutenant Martin would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the last such decoration earned during the fighting on Iwo Jima. The Marine detachment and nearby artillery crews responded quickly to the sounds of fighting, arriving in time to trap the Japanese attackers between their own defensive fire and the reorganized resistance of the camp's defenders. What followed was a vicious close-quarters battle fought with pistols, rifles, grenades, and bayonets as both sides struggled for control of the tented area. The fighting was particularly brutal because Japanese soldiers had adopted a deliberate policy of taking no prisoners, while American forces were equally determined to prevent any enemy escape back to the tunnel systems. By dawn on March 26th, virtually every Japanese soldier who had participated in the night attack lay dead among the wreckage of the tent camp. American casualties totaled 172 killed and wounded, a significant loss for what was supposed to be a secure rear area, but far less than the massacre that the Japanese assault could have achieved without Lieutenant Martin's heroic leadership. The attack had been tactically futile, but strategically significant, as proof that organized Japanese resistance continued despite official declarations of occupation. Investigation of the infiltration routes used during the March 25th attack revealed the extent of the underground tunnel network that American forces had failed to discover during 3 weeks of systematic clearing operations. Japanese engineers had created passageways that extended for miles beneath the island's surface, connecting defensive positions that appeared isolated to conventional reconnaissance. These tunnels explained how 300 enemy soldiers had been able to move undetected through supposedly secure American rear areas. They had simply traveled underground until emerging near their target. The tunnel system's sophistication exceeded anything American forces had encountered in previous Pacific campaigns. Multiple levels of passages provided alternate routes when primary tunnels were blocked or damaged by bombing and artillery fire. Ventilation systems allowed air circulation even in deep underground chambers, while drainage features prevented flooding during the island's occasional rainfall. Storage areas contained enough supplies to sustain thousands of men for months of siege warfare, explaining how Japanese resistance had continued long after conventional wisdom suggested that enemy forces should have been starved into submission. The mystery of Lieutenant General Kuribayashi's final fate added another layer of complexity to the battle's conclusion. American forces never found his body despite intensive searches of every captured position and tunnel system. Various theories suggested that he had led the March 25th attack personally, committed suicide in traditional Japanese fashion, or been killed in one of the many engagements that characterized the campaign's final weeks. Without physical evidence or reliable witness testimony, his death remained an unsolved puzzle that would intrigue military historians for decades. Some evidence suggested that Kuribayashi had maintained command authority until the very end of organized resistance, coordinating final defensive efforts through the extensive communication networks that linked surviving Japanese positions. Radio intercepts during late March included transmissions that American intelligence analysts believed came from the Japanese commanding general, though the poor quality of the communications and heavy Japanese use of code words made positive identification impossible. Whether he died leading the final attack in a subsequent engagement or in some other manner would remain historically uncertain. After the failure of the March 25th infiltration attack, Marine commanders finally declared the island conquered on March 26, 1945. This declaration, unlike earlier premature announcements, accurately reflected the end of organized Japanese resistance, capable of conducting coordinated operations against American forces. Yet, even this final declaration failed to account for the hundreds of individual Japanese soldiers who remained hidden throughout the island's extensive tunnel systems. Intelligence estimates suggested that approximately 2,000 Japanese soldiers remained hidden in undiscovered tunnel complexes throughout the island, potentially capable of continued guerrilla warfare for months if they chose to maintain resistance. The prospect of hunting down these remaining defenders posed enormous challenges for American forces that were already exhausted after a month of continuous combat. Army garrison troops would assume responsibility for mopping up operations, but their inexperience with Japanese defensive tactics and the unique challenges of Iwo Jima's terrain meant that clearing operations would continue for months after the Marines departed. Individual Japanese soldiers and small groups would continue surrendering or being killed in action well into 1946, demonstrating the longevity of Kuribayashi's defensive preparations. Some defenders remained hidden in the tunnel systems for months after the battle's official end, emerging only when starvation or medical emergencies forced them to seek American assistance. The final Japanese holdouts would not surrender until January 6, 1949, nearly 4 years after the battle had officially ended. The strategic implications of Iwo Jima's capture were immediately apparent as B-29 superfortresses began using the island's repaired airfields for emergency landings and refueling operations. Yet the campaign's enormous cost in American lives raised disturbing questions about the Pacific War's trajectory and the feasibility of future operations against the Japanese home islands. If a relatively small island with limited strategic value had required such enormous sacrifices, what would be the cost of invading Japan itself? The battle was declared over on March 26th, but 2,000 Japanese soldiers remained hidden underground. The real question wasn't whether Iwo Jima was worth it, it was whether America could afford many more victories like this. When the guns finally fell silent on Iwo Jima, American medical personnel began the grim task of tallying the human cost of 36 days in hell. The numbers that emerged would shock even veteran Pacific commanders who had witnessed the brutal arithmetic of island warfare since Pearl Harbor. Over 27,000 American casualties, approximately 6,800 dead and 20,000 wounded, represented losses that exceeded entire campaigns in the European theatre. The Japanese toll proved equally staggering in its completeness. Of the approximately 21,000 defenders who had awaited the American invasion, only 216 survived to be taken prisoner. The remainder had died exactly as Lieutenant General Kuribayashi had planned, selling their lives as dearly as possible while inflicting maximum damage on the attacking forces. Never before in the Pacific War had such a small piece of real estate consumed so many lives from both sides in such a brief period. Admiral Chester Nimitz, surveying the devastation while visiting the conquered island, struggled to find words that could adequately honour the sacrifice of the men who had fought there. His eventual tribute would become one of the most famous quotations in American military history. Among the Americans who served on Iwo Jima, uncommon valour was a common virtue. The phrase captured something essential about the battle. That extraordinary heroism had become so routine as to seem almost ordinary among men pushed beyond normal human limits. The Congressional Medal of Honor, America's highest decoration for military valor, was awarded 27 times to Marines and sailors who had fought on Iwo Jima. This number represented more medals of honor than any other single battle in American military history, reflecting both the intensity of the fighting and the countless acts of individual heroism that had characterized every day of the campaign. From John Bazilone's final charge to Lieutenant Harry Martin's sacrifice in the tent camp, These decorations told the story of a battle where survival itself required extraordinary courage. The human cost could be measured in more personal terms through the experiences of individual units that had borne the brunt of the fighting. Easy Company of the 2nd Battalion, 28th Marine Regiment, the unit that had raised the flag on Mount Suribachi and provided 3 of the 6 men in Joe Rosenthal's famous photograph, had suffered catastrophic casualties throughout the campaign. Unit records show that the company sustained losses that reflected the broader pattern of devastation experienced by frontline Marine units during the 36-day battle. Individual survivors carried psychological wounds that would never fully heal, along with physical injuries that served as permanent reminders of their time in hell. The black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima had worked its way into everything: clothing, equipment, weapons, and the very souls of the men who had fought there. Veterans would later report that decades after the battle, they could still taste the sulfur and feel the gritty volcanic dust that had coated every surface of their nightmare island. Marine survivors described experiences that seemed to belong in some medieval vision of hell rather than modern warfare. Letters home during brief respites from combat-captured sensory memories that would haunt these men for the rest of their lives. The smell of sulfur mixed with cordite and death, the feel of volcanic ash that burned exposed skin, and the sounds of wounded comrades calling for help created psychological imprints that no amount of time could erase. The trauma extended far beyond the men who had actually fought on the island. Across America, families received the dreaded telegrams that began with the words, "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret," followed by news that would shatter households from coast to coast. Gold Star mothers, wives, and children joined a growing community of Americans who had paid the ultimate price for victory in the Pacific, wondering whether their sacrifice had been justified by the strategic gains achieved. Belle Block of Yorktown, Texas, received word that her son Harlan had been killed in action during the fighting for northern Iwo Jima. She had been immensely proud when she learned that Harlan was one of the 6 Marines in the famous flag-raising photograph, only to discover weeks later that her pride would be forever mixed with grief. The irony was not lost on her that America's most iconic image of victory had been created by young men who would not live to see the war's end. The strategic debate over Iwo Jima's value began even before the last shots were fired. Critics argued that the island could have been bypassed entirely, leaving its garrison to wither on the vine, while American forces proceeded directly to more important targets closer to Japan. The enormous casualty toll seemed to support this argument. If such a small and relatively insignificant island had required such sacrifices, what horrors awaited American forces when they attempted to invade the Japanese home islands? Defenders of the operation pointed to immediate and tangible benefits that justified the human cost. The island's 2 repaired airfields had already begun serving as landing strips for B-29, superfortresses returning from bombing missions over Japan. Records show that 2,251 B-29 landings occurred on Iwo Jima during the war, though historical analysis reveals that many were routine refuelings or maintenance stops rather than life-threatening emergencies. The psychological impact of Iwo Jima's capture also provided benefits that were difficult to quantify, but nonetheless significant. American forces had proven they could overcome even the most sophisticated Japanese defensive preparations through superior firepower, innovative tactics, and sheer determination. The victory demonstrated that no Japanese position, however well prepared or fanatically defended, could ultimately resist American assault if sufficient resources were committed to the task. Yet, the campaign's influence on future Pacific operations proved more complex than simple encouragement. Military planners studying the casualty reports from Iwo Jima began to reconsider the feasibility of Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of the Japanese home islands, scheduled for late 1945. If 8 square miles of barren volcanic rock had cost 27,000 American casualties, what would be the price of conquering the major Japanese islands with their millions of inhabitants and extensive defensive preparations? The sobering mathematics of Pacific warfare were becoming impossible to ignore. Each successive island campaign had proven more costly than the last, as Japanese defensive techniques improved and American forces penetrated closer to Japan itself. Casualty projections for Operation Downfall ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American dead and wounded, figures that made even the most aggressive military commanders pause to consider alternatives. The development of atomic weapons would ultimately render these projections moot, but in March 1945, American political and military leaders faced the prospect of casualties that might make the sacrifices on Iwo Jima seem modest by comparison. President Harry Truman, who assumed office following Roosevelt's death in April, would later cite multiple factors in his decision to authorize the use of nuclear weapons against Japan, including the demonstrated tenacity of Japanese resistance and projected casualties for conventional invasion, based partly on the Iwo Jima experience. The human dimension of these strategic calculations became apparent during the memorial services held throughout the island, as American forces prepared to depart for their next assignments. The 5th Marine Division Cemetery, established in the shadow of Mount Suribachi, where so many had died, contained row upon row of white wooden crosses marking the graves of Marines who would never return home. The ceremony dedicating this sacred ground drew survivors from every unit that had participated in the battle, creating a gathering that was both celebration and wake. Chaplains struggled to find words that could provide comfort to men who had witnessed horrors beyond normal human experience. Traditional religious consolations seemed inadequate when applied to the industrial-scale slaughter that had characterized modern Pacific warfare. Instead, they focused on themes of sacrifice, brotherhood, and the belief that such suffering must ultimately serve some greater purpose in the moral order of the universe. The flag that flew over Mount Suribachi during the cemetery dedication was the same banner that had been raised by the 6 Marines immortalized in Rosenthal's photograph. 3 of those men now lay buried beneath the volcanic soil they had helped to capture, while the 3 survivors struggled with the weight of fame they had never sought and could never escape. The photograph had made them symbols of American victory, but they remained haunted by memories of friends who had died in their place through pure chance rather than any differences in courage or worthiness. As the memorial service concluded and Marines began boarding the ships that would carry them away from Iwo Jima forever, many found themselves changed in ways they could not yet articulate. They had survived an experience that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits and beyond, emerging with knowledge about themselves and their capacity for both heroism and horror that would shape the remainder of their lives. Some would spend decades trying to understand what they had witnessed and participated in during those 36 days of hell. Easy Company's survivors, like veterans throughout the invasion force, carried the weight of their experiences in different ways. Some found solace in the knowledge that their sacrifices had contributed to American victory and the eventual end of the war. Others struggled with survivors' guilt and the randomness of death that had claimed so many of their comrades while leaving them alive. All were united by shared experiences that could never be fully understood by those who had not been there. The strategic value of Iwo Jima would be debated by military historians for generations, with reasonable arguments supporting both sides of the controversy. What could not be debated was the extraordinary courage displayed by ordinary young Americans who had been asked to accomplish the impossible and had somehow found the strength to do exactly that. Their sacrifice had purchased 8 square miles of volcanic rock at a price that would haunt the American conscience and influence military decision-making for decades to come. But the story didn't end with the flag lowering. The official end of fighting on March 26, 1945, proved to be a bureaucratic fiction that bore little resemblance to the reality facing American occupation forces. Deep beneath Iwo Jima's volcanic surface, hundreds to several thousand Japanese soldiers remained hidden in the extensive tunnel networks that had taken months to construct and would take even longer to clear. These men had not surrendered. They had simply disappeared into the underworld that Kurabayashi's engineers had carved from solid rock. The 147th Infantry Regiment of the Ohio National Guard arrived to relieve the exhausted Marines, expecting to perform routine garrison duties on a conquered island. Instead, they found themselves thrust into a deadly and prolonged campaign against an enemy that materialized without warning from hidden cave entrances, struck at isolated positions, then vanished back underground before American forces could respond. These were not desperate suicide attacks. They were calculated operations by organized groups of defenders who continued to resist with remarkable tenacity. The Ohio Guardsmen, citizen soldiers who had trained for European warfare, struggled to adapt to the unique challenges of hunting an invisible enemy through volcanic terrain. Their operations during the spring and summer of 1945 proved far more dangerous and extensive than anyone had anticipated. The regiment would eventually report approximately 1,600 Japanese soldiers killed and 867 captured during their post-battle clearing operations, numbers that demonstrated the scale and intensity of continued resistance long after the island was officially declared secure. Individual Japanese survivors faced an impossible choice between death and dishonor as their hidden war dragged on through the changing seasons. Personal accounts from the few who eventually surrendered described conditions in the tunnel systems that had deteriorated from merely horrific to absolutely unbearable. Wounded men died slowly from gangrene and infected injuries. Soldiers subsisted on diminishing stores of rice and rainwater, and the constant fear of American flamethrower attacks made every moment a potential death sentence. Some defenders emerged during the spring of 1945 as starvation and disease made continued resistance impossible. Aircraft maintenance personnel who had survived the failed Banzai attacks finally surrendered after months of underground existence, choosing captivity over the slow death that awaited them in their volcanic sanctuaries. Their accounts revealed the sophistication of the tunnel networks and the determination of men who had maintained military discipline under conditions that would have broken most organized units. Yet some Japanese soldiers maintained their lonely vigil for years after the war's official end. The last 2 holdouts, Imperial Navy machine gunners Yamakage Kufuku and Matsudo Linsoki, would not emerge from their cave hideout until January 6, 1949, nearly 4 years after the battle's conclusion. Their surrender marked the true end of the Battle of Iwo Jima, though by then the world had moved on to other concerns, and their sacrifice had been largely forgotten by both nations. Meanwhile, the 3 surviving flag raisers faced a different kind of battle as they struggled to adapt to lives shaped by unwanted fame and survivor's guilt. Though historical research has since refined the identities of all 6 men in the photograph, the basic tragedy remains the same: young Americans thrust into celebrity they had never sought while carrying memories of friends who had died in their place through pure chance. Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian from Arizona, who had joined the Marines to serve his country despite centuries of mistreatment by the American government, found himself particularly ill-equipped to handle celebrity status. The war bond tour that followed his return to the United States transformed him into a reluctant spokesman for American patriotism, while he struggled with memories of combat and the weight of representing a moment he remembered primarily for the friends who had died shortly afterward. Alcohol became his refuge from a fame he had never wanted and could never escape. Hayes's story became a tragedy of American heroism and the hidden casualties of war. Despite being hailed as a national hero, he faced discrimination and poverty that reflected the treatment of Native Americans throughout the post-war period. His struggles with alcoholism and depression were exacerbated by the burden of representing American victory while privately questioning whether the sacrifices on Iwo Jima had served their intended purpose. The other survivors faced their own challenges in adapting to post-war civilian life. Some worked various jobs while struggling with the weight of representing a moment frozen in time, while others returned to quiet civilian careers and rarely spoke about their experiences, preferring to honor fallen comrades through silence rather than celebrity. Hayes died in January 1955 at the age of 32, found frozen in a field near his Arizona home after a night of drinking. His death symbolized the hidden casualties of war, men who survived the physical battle but could not overcome the psychological wounds that followed them home. Hayes was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, a gesture that came too late to help the troubled veteran who had never found peace after his moment of fame. The strategic impact of Iwo Jima extended far beyond the immediate tactical gains of capturing airfields and eliminating Japanese harassment of B-29 formations. The battle had demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of amphibious warfare in the modern era, providing lessons that would influence American military doctrine for decades to come. The coordination of naval gunfire, aerial bombardment, and ground assault had reached unprecedented levels of sophistication, yet the enormous casualties had raised disturbing questions about the sustainability of such operations. Military planners studying the Iwo Jima campaign developed new techniques for attacking heavily fortified positions that would prove valuable in future conflicts. The corkscrew and blowtorch tactics that combined flamethrowers, demolition charges, and coordinated infantry assault became standard doctrine for clearing enemy strongpoints. The lessons learned about tunnel warfare would prove particularly relevant during later conflicts where American forces again faced enemies who used underground networks to frustrate conventional military operations. Yet, the battle's most lasting legacy may have been its impact on American strategic thinking about the cost of victory. The enormous casualties relative to the island's size and strategic value contributed to military and political calculations about the feasibility of Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan that was projected to cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. The demonstrated cost of defeating determined Japanese resistance became one factor among many in President Truman's decision to authorize the use of atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki rather than pursue conventional invasion. The cultural impact of Rosenthal's flag-raising photograph transcended its immediate propaganda value to become one of the most recognizable images in American history. The picture captured something essential about American ideals. Young men working together to plant their nation's flag on foreign soil, won through enormous sacrifice. Yet the human cost behind that iconic image, 3 of the 6 men killed within weeks of the photograph, added layers of meaning that transformed the image from simple triumph into something more complex and haunting. The photograph inspired the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia, where Felix de Welden's bronze sculpture immortalized the flag-raising moment in metal that would outlast the flesh and blood of the men it commemorated. The memorial became a pilgrimage site for veterans and families seeking to honor military sacrifice though its idealized representation of victory could never capture the full reality of what had occurred on that volcanic island in the Pacific. The reconciliation between former enemies has perhaps provided the most meaningful long-term legacy of the Battle of Iwo Jima. Joint commemorative ceremonies involving American and Japanese veterans have transformed the island from a symbol of national conflict into a memorial for shared human sacrifice. Former enemies, meeting as old men on the battlefields of their youth, have found common ground in their memories of comrades lost and the recognition that courage and honor were displayed by soldiers on both sides of the conflict. What does the Battle of Iwo Jima teach us about human nature under extreme stress? Perhaps that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demand it, but that such heroism comes at a price that extends far beyond the immediate physical casualties. The psychological wounds carried by survivors like Ira Hayes remind us that victory in war is always incomplete, and that the true cost of conflict includes damage that may not become apparent until years after the shooting stops. Admiral Nimitz's observation that uncommon valor was a common virtue among the Americans who served on Iwo Jima captures something essential about the battle's meaning. It was not that these men were inherently braver or more noble than other human beings, but that they found within themselves reserves of courage and determination that enabled them to accomplish what seemed impossible. That capacity for heroism exists within ordinary people everywhere, waiting to be called forth by circumstances that we hope will never arise, but for which we must always be prepared. Today, Iwo Jima appears much as it did to that aviator in December 1944, a burned pork chop in the middle of the ocean, covered in black volcanic sand with no trees and no fresh water. But now it serves as something more than a strategic position or a geographic curiosity. It has become a memorial to the men who fought there, a reminder of what human beings will sacrifice for the ideals they hold dear, and a testament to the truth that freedom is never free, but must be purchased again and again with the blood of those brave enough to defend it. The echo of those 36 days in hell continues to reverberate through American memory, reminding each new generation that the privileges they enjoy were bought at a price that can never be repaid, only honored through remembrance and the commitment to prove worthy of such sacrifice.